off, a builder hovered in the water. She was watching, but not with her eyes. Light was not that helpful here. Instead, she used other senses. Tendrils she had spun out of her embraced flatbed, the Montana submarine, the seals, and the missile in an invisible web, each strand only molecules thick. Next to these, the threads of the fiber optic communication system seemed thick and clumsy, and with these she tasted and touched to discover what was happening. The humans were opening this missile and removing the death inside. It might be a good sign, but then it might not. Who could understand these creatures who allowed each other's precious memories to perish when their bodies died? Who fought against death with terrible fury, but made weapons that could shatter all their works and lay waste an entire planet? Still, the city had been studying. The fleeting contact with Jammer's living brain had given them a great deal of information on how to interpret the memories of the dead they had taken from the Montana. They had figured out how to translate radio broadcasts into sound and television signals into pictures. They had even decoded human languages after a fashion. Now, though, they were finally able to make sense out of our actions and our words, by seeing how our brains worked, what we remembered, how it felt to be human. Words that had been empty code patterns to them suddenly took on meaning. Decades-old broadcasts that had lain dormant in the city's spires of memory were now being examined in a frenzy of activity. The builders had shut down almost all activity except the effort to comprehend what these strange creatures meant by the incomprehensible things they did. Long before they understood our languages, they had developed a label for us, a way to think of us in their own wordless communications. They thought of all non-builders, whatever their species, as forgetters, the equivalent of our concept of animal. Creatures that move as if with purpose, but are not capable of real thought. Until the Montana submarine, we had belonged in that category in their minds. Now, though, they knew we were rememberers like them, though our memories were cut tragically short by one of the morbid accidents of biology. So, to distinguish us from themselves and from the forgetters, they thought of us as those who kill each other on purpose. In the meantime, the city gathered more and more heat out of the waters of the Caribbean, till it warmed the sea directly under Hurricane Frederick, as well as the water in front of the storm. The radiating warmth heated the air above it, steadily lowering the air pressure inside the hurricane. Eventually it would surpass all previous records, and Frederick was a controlled storm, with the builders herding it toward Deep Core. It was going to be the worst hurricane in history. There was no malice in it. The builders were going to probe Deep Core in an effort to gather information about these air breathers. Though Deep Core was at the lower limits of survival for human beings, it was near the upper limits for builders who were not safely locked within a porter's body. They were genetically reshaping several porters into a probe that could survive in the breathing mixture that filled Deep Core. But in order to take it up to the dangerously thin seawater at 2,000 feet, the builders themselves would be exposed. Therefore, they had to be sure that Deep Core was alone. Hurricane Frederick would sweep the sea above them and keep it clear until they had learned from Deep Core's crew all that could be learned. Out of the range of the lights, the builders watched. They reached in with their slender filaments, touched, tasted. They found the bodies of the dead long before the ROVs did, scanned and recorded their memories. The city had learned much since their contact with Jammer, the human. They understood the memories they found, and now with hundreds of dead, the men from the Montana submarine, the Russians whose bodies sank far enough down before their brains were cold, and these men from Deep Core, they were building up a thorough picture of mankind. And they were horrified. How well they had named these creatures. Most of them were filled with memories of planning and training to kill. Memories of the fear of death, anger and terror and loneliness. At times the city almost despaired of finding any common ground with these creatures at all. There were Barnes, the sonar man from the Montana. In his last moments, he had not been lonely. He had gone back in his own memory to a place where he was happy, a place where he belonged, to people who were part of him, people in whose memory he would live on, so that death held more of grief than terror for him. Most of the men had memories of family, of course, but their memories were ambiguous, muddy, and filled with conflict and rebellion. Their lives were focused around war. Their most important associations were with their fellow soldiers. The builders had no way of knowing that most of these men were really still adolescents, only recently on their own, still celebrating their independence from their families, and still in search of their own identity. And the older men were career soldiers, good ones, but by necessity and choice. They had opted to leave their families behind for months on end. It was not a balanced sample of humanity, but it was the only sample the builders had ever found. So the preponderance of evidence was that human beings loved war, lived for killing, a swarm of vicious worms swallowing each other, but reproducing faster than they could devour. The city could not imagine communicating with them. And yet they had to find a way, didn't they? Now that the builders could make sense of the humans' broadcasts and transmissions, they knew what both sides the current troubles did not, could not know, that neither side would back down, that each was so terrified that the other meant to strike that both were planning to strike first, before their weapons could be destroyed. The world was days, hours away from the order for missiles to fly. The builders were in no immediate danger on the bottom of the sea. There would be little direct damage, but the planet would die at the surface, and within a few years that death would lead to stagnation, then starvation at the bottom of the world. The builders would have to leave this world with their work unfinished. The plan was for each city to become an ark, rising out of the ocean to soar upward into space, flying off in search of other worlds where they could start the cycle of life again. But that was still a long time away, and the only city that was ready for flight was this one, here in the Cayman Trench. And it was only ready because it had arrived here ready. It was the first, from which all the other cities had been founded. So if they had to leave, all they could do was gather together the memories of the other cities and then embark on its voyage as a single ark. A failure, because this world had given rise to no more arks than had arrived here. The only profit from their sojourn on Earth would be the memory of this mad species, which had somehow become intelligent without ever really learning how to understand themselves. The worst of it, though, was this. The crisis that these humans faced was not entirely of their own making. Their weapons and their enmities had all existed before. But from their broadcasts and messages, the builders knew now how much of their fear and anger was caused by things the builders themselves had inadvertently done. "We are not responsible for their nature," said the city. "We didn't make their weapons. But they had those most terrible weapons for a long time, as they measure time, through many wars, and yet they never used them once they saw how terrible they were, until we destroyed their satellite." "To save them from war," answered the city. "Yes, but they didn't know it. They didn't understand us, and so they were terrified. And then we destroyed their submarine and killed their crew. It was an accident, an unintended glider. They didn't move out of the way. They didn't know us. They weren't prepared for us. We were the ones who caused the things that made them so afraid. And if they now use their weapons that they so long refrained from using, will it be their fault or our own? Partly ours. More than that, They were learning to control themselves out of fear of each other, true, but it was serving them well enough. We did what each of them was too terrified to do. We provoked them. The fault is ours. And the city tasted the strange and bitter flavor of shame. How can we leave now with this memory? Yet how can we undo what we have done? How can we explain to them the truth about what has been happening when seeing one of us so terrifies them that they almost die? There's one who saw us and wasn't afraid. Then she's the one we'll try to speak to. Go to her and see if you can put your thoughts into her mind. See if she can understand. 100 meters below the lip of the abyss, the builders hovered in the water. So far, everything was working well. They had waited until Lindsay was separated from all the others. Then they have moved closer, which damped the power in Deep Core. But they sent forth tendrils to draw away all the power from the communication systems. They would be alone with Lindsay, without distraction or interference. Now they sent new tendrils out to her, only a few molecules wide. They found the cracks in her suit, at the neck, at every fastening, and gathering and polymerizing the ambient water vapor in her suit. The tendrils grew until they had found their way through her ears, her nostrils, her mouth, her nose, back into her brain. There they followed the pathways of her brain and mind, touching every neuron and bridging every synapse. This was no project now for a single builder. A dozen of them were scanning her brain, and then, together, interpreting what they read there. She's afraid. They didn't want her to be afraid, to panic and hurt herself the way Jammer the human did. So now, in order to calm her, they made their first effort at direct communication. If they had been human, using human speech, they would have whispered to her, gently assuring her, a sort of lullaby. Don't be afraid. Be at peace. Be at peace. But they were not human. So their meaning came, not as words, but as molecules. Chemicals that they believed would communicate the feeling of peace to Lindsay. Lindsay was still hearing nothing. She tried to reach everybody using her FO and then UQC. Catfish, do you copy? Over. She felt herself starting to panic, heard the desperation in her own voice. Bud, do you copy? Over. Then the power dimmed even further. It should have frightened her more, but instead, she felt somewhat calmer. Catfish, I seem to be having a problem here. Over. And then she felt no need to call out any more. What was she so worried about? Everything would be all right. She had no idea why she would feel this way, yet she did. She had complete confidence. She had nothing to fear. She was at peace. It's working, the builders said. She heard us. It was time for the next step. Something small. The porter that she had caught a glimpse of before. It would be somewhat familiar to her. It would also seem like a machine to her, with a firm, unfluctuating structure, from what they knew of humans now, and what they knew of Lindsay. They were quite sure she'd feel less threatened if she thought it was a machine. So the porter darted upward from the chasm. It saw her, and like a puppy, recognizing its master, it quickly moved into place behind her. Lindsay saw only the patterns of light on the equipment in front of her. She turned slowly, and still completely unafraid, and saw before her a machine. Was it what she had seen before? The body of it was smooth, slightly arched, like a leaping fish, but it was no fish. And at the front there was an opening like the front of a jet engine, but it was no engine. Inside was a circle with bright points radiating outward, like a child's drawing of the sun. It was spinning, and light danced inside it. Then it turned sideways, Its shell or skin or body was transparent, like perfect crystal glass. Colors shone in patterns on the skin as it moved, as if it were reflecting some outward source of light. But there was no light except what came from inside the thing. Structures of different colors, glowing, connecting inside like a machine. Or was it a biological system? She couldn't tell, nor could she guess what its purpose was. But it was beautiful. She marveled at its perfect grace. She admires it. She wants to know and understand it. And when she sees without fear, then she can love. The builders remembered this thought because they knew it was important. Fear was the great controller of human beings. Fear was bringing them to the brink of war. Fear drove them away from each other, kept most of them from risking anything in their lives. There was good evolutionary reason for fear to be so strong in them. They could die, not just in the body, but in the memory as well. Of course, they feared death. If we died so completely, we would fear it too. But with the fear removed, the true self remained behind. Lindsay was filled with eagerness to see more, to understand all. She was ready. Still, the builders were careful. The sight of a builder in her natural shape had frightened Jammer, and Lindsay had a particular affinity for machines. So the builder Lindsay would meet would be inside a glider, not in her natural shape. Again, it would be like a machine, but this time a machine filled with intelligence. The porter was reluctant to leave, sensing that Lindsay desired him to stay, though it received this information more from the builders than from Lindsay herself. It drifted backward, then rose up out of sight. Lindsay's gaze followed the porter as it disappeared. Then she saw a sight that took her breath away. A large, smooth shape, rising upward slowly from below. It was bright, with inner light, its surface smooth and perfect, its shape gracefully undulant. Interior lights moved and danced within it. It was the light of life, of thought, of memory. It was transparent, its walls so perfectly clear that they were almost invisible. There was no building material known that could be so transparent and yet so strong that it could hold such a structure without twisting or shattering. No architect or engineer could have designed this thing. It had no place in the natural order of the earth. She knew at once that this was the work of a stranger, a newcomer, but not an interloper, not an intruder. It would not interfere with her or any other human, if it could help it. It lived in the deepest part of the sea, where human beings could never go. There was no enmity between humanity and these things, these people. How did she know this? She had no idea, but she was certain of it. It was beyond question, like the way she knew that she could reach out her hand and touch it. It was a dangerous, unreasonable thing to do, yet she had no doubt that she could do it, and she wanted to, with all her heart. It would be unbearable to see such beauty and leave it untouched. So she laid her hand against its wing-like arch as it slowly rotated over her. The surface was smooth and hard. It did not yield under her fingers, and yet it glided by under her hand, utterly without friction. She saw it moving, yet could not feel its motion. What are you? Who built you? And who is inside you? And then a desire she remembered from childhood, the desire that had kept her with her father, forsaking all the other attractions of youth. Teach me how to make such things. Plenty of time for that, she thought. There's no hurry. Now that we've met, there's plenty of time. You can tell me all your memories, voyages across the endless abyss of space, the hot flaring light of suns, the exquisite relief of sinking down again into the cool deeps of a new sea, there to begin again. You are builders. I know that. Builders like me, only far older and more experienced. Our bodies are so utterly different that we can only meet here, in this difficult place, but our minds are not so unlike that we can't communicate.